The Society of Toxicology of Canada, STC, is extremely excited to begin featuring some of our members and to celebrate their research and contributions to the field of toxicology, as well as to provide some insight to current and future trainees about career paths in toxicology. So today, STC is excited to feature an interview with Dr. Bernard Robaire. Dr. Bernard Robaire is a decorated toxicologist whose research focuses on the effects of environmental toxicants and aging on the male reproductive system. His research has contributed to over 200 journal articles, 70 book chapters, editing and co-editing of 10 books, and 268 abstracts and presentations at meetings. Dr. Robaire received his BA in bacteriology at UCLA and PhD in pharmacology and therapeutics at McGill University. After completing a postdoctoral fellowship in reproductive biology at Johns Hopkins University, Dr. Robaire now works as a professor in the departments of pharmacology and therapeutics and obstetrics and gynecology at McGill University. He has mentored several undergraduate, graduate, postgraduate, and medical students, most of whom go on to attain positions across various disciplines within academia, industry, and government. Over the years, Dr. Robaire has received many awards, including the Distinguished Academic Award from the Canadian Association of University Teachers, the Distinguished Andrologist Award from the American Society of Andrology, the Janssen Distinguished Leadership and Service Award from the Society for the Study of Reproduction, the Prix Guy Rocher FQPPU, and was elected a Fellow in the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences in 2020. For years, Dr. Robaire has been an active member of the Society of Toxicology of Canada and received the STC Gabrielle Elplois Award of Distinction in 2017, which recognizes those who have made outstanding and sustained contributions to the science of toxicology in Canada. With that, I'd like to give a warm welcome to Dr. Robaire.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm happy to participate.
How did you learn about STC and what made you interested in becoming a member?
I learned about STC before it was STC. One of the professors I had when I was a graduate student was Alan Nimes, who was involved in the transformation of the former society that was called Society for Research in Toxicology to the Society of Toxicology of Canada. I have followed STC closely over the years. I have attended many meetings, but I only became a regular member in 2012, I believe. But I had attended several meetings before and several of the international toxicology meetings, namely the one in Montreal in 2007 and some of the ones in Europe.
That's great. So you've been a member for many years and you've actually got to see the growth of STC to what it's become today. So that's really amazing. What has been your most memorable experience as a member of STC?
I don't think I can identify one. To me, what's amazing about STC is the major interplay between researchers in government, industry, and academia, and the ability of having an open and free discussion, both in the scientific sessions and in the social events where people really associate and discuss all sorts of things, is what makes STC a very unique society. It's very rare to have a cohesive group of individuals who are open to interacting with students, postdocs, senior scientists in an informal as well as a formal manner. Wonderful to be able to go to these meetings and see some of my graduates who are in academia, in industry, and in government, and run into them in all three areas. It's fun.
Yeah, and especially seeing their growth of where they started and where they ended up. Like that must be great as like a supervisor in your position.
That's actually the most rewarding aspect of being a researcher in the field and being a professor. It's really not the papers we put out. It's not the individual scientific contribution. Those are great, but the most important aspect of my life, at least, has been the trainees I have had and the influence I have been able to provide, or some of the ideas I've been able to guide students with over many years and seeing how their careers evolve. It's wonderful.
What got you interested in toxicology and actually led you to where you are today?
My first interest in toxicology actually came as an undergraduate. I was at UCLA at the time when the smog was really high. And after I finished my bachelor's, I finished in March there on a quota system. So I had time between then and beginning graduate school at McGill. And I decided to put a small course together that UCLA allowed me to sponsor on smog, and brought in people from the city. They were talking about changing to having natural gas cars They were talking about the potential of electric engines. And so I got very involved in air pollution at the time. I did not stay in toxicology because when I came to McGill, there was nobody doing that kind of research at the time. I was also very interested in reproduction and population growth. So I really focused my research for many years in the area of reproduction. And then toxicology came back into my life in the 1980s when somebody asked, a clinician actually asked after I gave grand rounds, what are the potential toxic effects of chemotherapy on the male reproductive system? And that's how I got back into toxicology. And we started with some of the toxic effects of chemicals. And then from there, around 2000, there was an initiative of the federal government that allowed new research in the field of toxicology. And several of us put team grants together. And I've been working in team grants pretty much continuously since the early 90s, but in 2001, we had several team grants, and we've continued with both after the TDI, after the Federal Toxicology Initiative that lasted only 3 years. We then got some team grants on environmental chemicals, specifically on trying to replace the plasticizer phthalates and on brominated flame retardants. And our most current team grant is on trying to find replacements to determine whether the replacements that are introduced for established endocrine disruptors, whether those replacements are actually safer or worse than the chemicals they're replacing.
You were talking about how you were applying for many different grants and, more recently team grants. And I remember reading from one of your previous interviews where you were saying initially when you actually got back into toxicology, you applied for a grant. And when you submitted it, you didn't get the greatest of reviews. To where you are now, it's such a night and day difference.
Well, when you're in research, you have to learn to accept failure. Mm-hmm. There are many times when you put out ideas that are a little bit out of the mainstream, a lot out of the mainstream. And the peer review system, by definition, has a hard time coping with ideas that are out of the mainstream. And so when we propose that exposure of males to drugs could affect the children, mm-hmm. that was viewed as a radical idea, because at the time, the only thing people thought of was the pregnancy and the mother being exposed. It has now become routinely accepted. Just about every paper talks about it. So we sort of helped create the field of male-mediated developmental toxicity, but it's not a separate field. It's become part of the normal routine of everyday thinking today.
Where did your interest in assessing and investigating the effects on aging on the male reproductive system from?
So I had done my postdoctoral studies at Hopkins, Johns Hopkins, and the person with whom I worked created a team grant, and he asked me to be an advisory member on his team grant, and he was studying aging. He was studying aging of steroidogenic cells, of Leydig cells in the testis. And he wanted me to be there as an advisor to the group. And after the 3-year grant finished, when they went in for the renewal, they invited me to be a member because they felt I had contributed more than just as advisor. So I had an NIH component of that grant in my lab for about 10 years. And I really got interested in aging because, again, the dogma had been that we know that mother's age is important for reproduction. We know that the women reach menopause sometime between 40 and 50. Mm-hmm. And we know that the quality of the eggs go down with age. That's dogma. The idea that the father's sperm quality would change with age was never viewed as an acceptable concept. The father was never the one responsible, right? It was always the mother's fault. We did studies in the late 90s where we actually took rats of different ages and mated them to young females. And what we found is that the older the father was, the more problems there was, not only with getting the females pregnant, but more importantly, the progeny had different weights and a much higher postnatal death rate. And so that got me to thinking, what's the mechanism behind that? Why is that happening? And so we've been following that up now for several years. And our most recent paper in the topic has been idea that the methylation pattern of the sperm, epigenetic marks in the sperm, change with age. And that is probably the reason for which the quality of the sperm, in fact, decreases with father's age above 45.
So you previously talked about how your research looks at the sperm and epigenetic modifications with aging, but some of your research does look at male contraceptives. Could you provide more information on male contraceptives, given that it's something that's really unfamiliar, and if there's any future clinical studies that are being conducted?
My interest in male contraception stems back to my postdoc. The reason I went to Johns Hopkins was to work with Larry Ewing, who had developed a method for suppressing spermatogenesis without affecting serum testosterone levels. And I was very excited about that. We worked on that. We had several papers together on that topic. And in fact, there is now there's been a lot more research that has been done trying to come up with a male contraceptive than was ever done trying to come up with female contraceptives. It's a really challenging problem. Men produce 1,000 sperm every heartbeat. Women produce 1 egg every month. We're trying to find a way of preventing either the making or the functioning of those sperm is really challenging. There are methods that have evolved, some of them based on our initial studies to the clinical stage. So there's several hormonal methods being tested clinically now. There are also a series of new methods that are using post-testicular methods, so non-hormonal male contraceptives that are being developed to the level of the epididymis or the level of the vas deferens. We always hope that there will be a new method in the next 5 years. It might happen. I think we're moving faster towards that goal, but it is a really challenging, complicated problem.
As you mentioned it, for years you've focused predominantly, on the male reproductive system with toxicants as well as aging. But recently, you've started publishing papers that look at female reproductive biology and toxicology. Could you give a little bit more insight on the thought process that goes behind deciding your areas of research?
So they're all connected. If you treat female, if you're treating pregnancy and you want to look at the effects on the male, which is our initial drive, well, in the progeny, you've got males and females, right? So I really believe in not using the minimal number of animals and trying to optimize animal use. So if you have all of these females, we decided to look at them. And lo and behold, there are pretty major effects that people hadn't identified before. And so as a consequence, we have a paper that's come out on bisphenols a few weeks ago, and we're looking at different cell lines. And so there are male reproduction cell lines and female reproduction cell lines. And we have another one submitted on plasticizers, and there'll be another one on organophosphates. And we're comparing male and female cell lines and seeing how these chemicals and their replacements are affecting key cell lines in the reproductive tissues.
That's really exciting. And you investigate obviously male and female sides of things, as well as looking at different toxicants. What do you think the next big thing will be within this field?
I think the field is in a major transition phase. I think the field toxicology is going to explode over the next few years for many reasons. One of the major breakthroughs is NAMs, new approach methodologies, where we can now look at using in silico and in vitro methods to try to predict what is going to be a toxic chemical, or have a pretty good idea of what might be have high toxicity, so we don't use it. So the application of NAMs, the reduction in the use of animals, the ability of moving into predictive toxicology. It's still very hard today, but the tools are becoming available. So I think for anybody who's coming into this field, learning to deal with big data, because there's huge amount of data that is being generated and that these methods generate. Being familiar with informatics, bioinformatics, and wanting to solve how we can identify what are the chemicals in the environment that are having deleterious effects both on the environment and on the health of people and animals. That's where we're going to go. And I think the new methods, the power of the new techniques are going to make the field really exciting over the next 10, 20 years.
So I've heard that you've been known to have a passion for Sherlock Holmes and his mysteries. So can you tell us about that? Is there any relationship between toxicology and Sherlock Holmes?
Oh, lots. So I started reading Sherlock Holmes stories when I was a teenager, and I've gone through all the books. I have all the 60 stories in my head, and many of the movies, and there are many relationships. I mean, he was a problem solver, right? When you do research, you're being a detective. You're trying to solve a problem. You have a question and you want to solve it, which every case in Sherlock Holmes is that. And then you combine that with a number of cases where there were toxicants. Actually, one of the lectures, I've been giving a course in toxicology at McGill since 2002 now. And for a while, I had a whole lecture on the poisons in the canon. The 60 stories I refer to as the canon for Sherlockians. And so I had a whole lecture on that. That was a fun lecture to give. And actually, that's teaching that course is one of the things that has increased my interest in toxicology. I knew enough to be asked to be in charge of that course in 2002. And we went from having about 12 students in the course to now having about 140 students. It's a large course, but we still have students get involved in short presentations, term papers, and so on. And they pick their own toxicants and they work on them. But I love teaching that course. It's one of the most exciting aspects of what I do every year is interacting with the students and the graduates in that course.
I guess your students kind of correlate you to their own Sherlock Holmes in a way.
Yes.
Over the years, you have received many awards, one of which is the Gabrielle Outlaw Award of Distinction from the Society of Toxicology of Canada. What would you attribute your success in toxicology to?
To be honest, I was really surprised at getting any of these awards. It was wonderful to get them. I don't think I can tell you what makes a success. I think you do the best you can. You train your students, you write papers. Every paper I submit is something I'm proud of. And you just do the best science you can. You try to answer questions that are relevant. And then whatever comes, comes. And if a consequence of that is that you never get cited, that's life. And if a consequence of that is that people recognize it and want to give you prizes, that's wonderful. But that's not why I've done any of it.
What advice would you give to students who are interested in pursuing graduate studies or a career in toxicology?
I think the most important thing in graduate school is to learn how to think critically, how to write, how to analyze a problem and solve it. And the nature of the problem is almost secondary. If you have the tools, if you know how to do science, and if you know how to take a problem, dissect it, identify the gaps, figure out how to solve the gaps, and design the proper critical experiments to move the field forward, then you've achieved your goal in graduate work. In your postdoc is when you identify the field that you really want to move into. And so the training in postdoc should be complementary, but it's really in the postdoc phase where you identify where you want to make your mark over the next 15 or 20 years. So yes, you've got to enjoy the lab you're in, you've got to enjoy the methods you're in, picking a good environment. I think the other aspect is every graduate student should interview not only their professors, but the other students in that lab to make sure they're going to go to a lab where they are going to be happy and comfortable. If it's stressful to go through to the PhD level, most graduate students at some point want to quit. That's not surprising because you hit a lot of walls because you're inventing new things. If you're going to really be doing a valuable PhD, you will be breaking ground. You will be coming up with new ideas, new methods, and you will hit stumbling blocks. And being able to go over those stumbling blocks is what will make you a good scientist.
As a young trainee, that's really inspiring and like motivates me to forgo higher education. Thank you. I really appreciate that kind of advice.
It's my pleasure. The reward from finding something new, the internal excitement about seeing that you're breaking ground in an area, there's nothing like it.
It was really nice to get a little bit of insight on what it's like from the life of Dr. Bernard Robaire and what his research has been like over the past few years. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. And it was fun chatting with you.